Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Righteous Fury by Terrance D. Williamson. Narrated by Kirsten Potter. Chapter 1. Liberation. Deep in earth my love is lying, and I must weep alone. Edgar Allan Poe. Sit, the Allied officer ordered Eleanore gruffly after he opened a door to a small interview room with large, clear windows. Eleanore froze in the doorway at the sight of the cement floor stained with blood. Her fear intensified when she spotted the shackles fastened to the gray iron table, and she shuddered to think of the malicious purpose of this room. With a slight nudge, the officer guided Eleanore inside and brushed past her as he pulled out a chair for himself. Despite his impoliteness, Eleanore found herself trusting this man and didn't detect that he wished her any harm. Besides, manners were forgotten in the hell of a concentration camp, even from the liberators. Sitting across from him, Eleanore winced at the strain on her stomach and held her belly as she positioned herself on the chair. The Nazi doctor had been careless with the stitches on her stomach, and they caught on the fabric of her borrowed dress, causing great discomfort with even slight movements. Abruptly, the man threw his satchel onto the table and retrieved a black pen, a frayed leather notepad, and a pack of cigarettes. Lighting his cigarette, the man didn't offer one to Eleanore, who half expected the gesture to be customary. "May I have one?" Eleanore asked with longing. In normal circumstances, she wouldn't dare be so bold, but her time at Auschwitz had altered her sense of propriety. "No." The man shook his head quickly as he wrote. "What are you writing?" Eleanore grew annoyed at his rudeness. Irritated by the interruption, the man closed his eyes as he muttered to himself softly, struggling to remember something pertinent which Eleanore had inadvertently driven away. "Right," he nodded and continued writing, ignoring Eleanor's question as she sighed at the disregard. "How do you know German so well?" Eleanore continued to pester him. "Your accent is familiar." "My name is Hans Volker," he finally replied, and sat up straight while looking at her with disinterest. "I grew up in Berlin." "You're Jewish?" Eleanore asked, but felt herself feeling faint from exhaustion and trauma. "I am, as were those American soldiers who wanted to kill that Nazi officer." "Then why did you stop them?" Eleanore squinted. "A dead Nazi can't talk." Hans looked out the window at the Allies busying themselves with raiding the other offices across the hallway and collecting the documents and evidence that weren't destroyed. "And the world needs to know what has happened here." "I'm still confused as to why you need me." Eleanore shook her head. "Why did you single me out?" "Vengeance." Hans spoke coldly. "I'm not much use when it comes to violence," Eleanore huffed. Being rather petite, Eleanore was of little threat to anyone, even in her best physical condition. "Rudolf Huss." Hans blurted the name, and Eleanore froze in terror at the mention of him. "He was the father, wasn't he?" He nodded to her belly. Eleanor's eyes welled as she thought of her child. The Nazis had stolen that future from her, and she felt the absence of her baby with every breath. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, she replied with a simple nod. "The commandant of Auschwitz has escaped, and I have been tasked with tracking him down." Hans leaned in and folded his hands as he spoke quietly. "Escaped?" Eleanore frowned. "Yes." Hans nodded quickly. "How does his escape involve me?" Eleanore shook her head. "Will you help me hunt him down and bring him to justice?" Eleanore stared at Hans in complete shock. She didn't believe that she had heard him correctly. Then, swiftly, Eleanore reached across the table, grabbed Hans's cigarettes, took one out of the package, and held it to her mouth as she waited for him to light it. With his hands folded, Hans studied her for a moment. Then, reluctantly, he reached into his satchel and retrieved some matches. Lighting one, he held it against her cigarette as she stared into his eyes, testing his character. Inhaling deeply, Eleanore leaned back in her chair before exhaling a cloud of smoke that swirled about in the stagnant air. The room began to spin as she closed her eyes. She was hungry, desperately, and it had been an age since her last cigarette, which she now savored. A shout from outside the room startled Eleanore, and she looked through the window to see a young soldier, no older than 18, shaking and scrambling to pick up the documents that he had accidentally scattered in the hallway. A senior officer shouted impatiently at the blunder, which only increased the unsteadiness of the boy. Clearing his throat, Hans regained Eleanor's attention. While she wasn't the best judge of character, Eleanore read well enough into Hans's expression that he wasn't relishing the request for assistance from her. He seemed, to her, to be emotionally distant and calculated, but Eleanore surmised that this was due to him being overwhelmed with what he was experiencing. Regardless, it made her question the purpose of him asking her for help. Not to mention that the disparity between them made her feel rather self-conscious. Nearly twice his age, Eleanore sat across from him as a shadow of herself, in a tattered, bullet-filled dress, while he was clean-shaven with a smart, pressed uniform in perfect order. She would have preferred to have been afforded the dignity of being interviewed as his equal, but understood that he viewed her as pitiful. It wasn't his fault, she realized, as her sad appearance evoked an emotional response that only a few would be immune to. Although young, there was a maturity in his gaze. Eleanore could sense a mischievous spirit about him which, she supposed, made him adept at his job. If he was going to hunt down Nazis such as Rudolf Huss, then he had to be cunning and carry a sharper wit than his prey. "Well," Hans became impatient, "will you help me find Rudolf Huss?" "That depends." Eleanore tapped her cigarette gently, shaking off the ash as Hans continued to stare at her with a grave expression. She assumed that this was his first experience with the barbarity of the Nazis, and he was trying to compensate by covering up his emotions. "On what?" Hans shrugged. "What do you believe I can contribute?" Eleanore squinted as she took another puff. "You were his lover, no?" Hans crossed his arms. "No." Eleanore frowned and shook her head quickly, disgusted at the very thought. "But you carried his child." Hans looked at her suspiciously. "That doesn't require love." Eleanore spoke softly as she looked away. "He took you by force, then?" Hans's intrigue grew, and Eleanore spotted a plot forming in his mind. The severity of his frown lessened, and Eleanore noticed his opinion of her shifting faintly. "Not necessarily." Eleanore swallowed, wishing he would use a little more tact in his questioning. It was an uncomfortable discussion even in the best of circumstances. "I'm not following." Hans watched her intently. "I offered myself for the sake of another." Eleanore returned to staring into his eyes, but to say I had a choice in the matter would be false. He didn't force me through physical means, but he didn't offer me the opportunity to deny him either. "Well, Miss Hodis," Hans returned to folding his hands as he leaned in, unmoved by Eleanor's trials. "I'm offering you the opportunity to exact revenge on this man. Will you not assist me?" "What can I do?" Eleanore shook her head in bewilderment. "You knew him best." Hans tilted his head. "Did he mention anything about where he would go, places he would hide?" "I didn't know him best." Eleanore grew indignant. "I barely knew the man at all." "You knew him a hell of a lot better than me." Hans pointed to her still swollen belly. "How dare you?" Eleanore stood, but regretted the rash movement as the room began to spin around her. "You have no idea what I did to survive, or what I did to alleviate another's sorrows." Hans remained silent as he watched her for a moment, before slowly taking out another cigarette and lighting it as he stared into her eyes. One would hardly need to be perceptive to decipher his thoughts as he looked at her with a slight scowl. He believed that she had behaved dishonorably and taken the path of convenience rather than principle. She might have assumed the same, Eleanore supposed, if she was in his position. Then, while still holding his cigarette, Hans reached into his satchel and produced a small brown envelope, which he handed to Eleanore. Watching him warily, Eleanore sat and opened it as she pulled out the documents enclosed. Written in English, Eleanore struggled with the complexity of the wording. She could understand a moderate level of English, but legal jargon was challenging to comprehend. She could, however, decipher the words War Crimes Investigation Team. "What's this?" Eleanore looked up at him. "I have been tasked with gathering information for the upcoming war crimes trials in Belsen." Hans spoke softly. "I believe that you have valuable information which, if we catch him, will help us bring Rudolf Huss to justice. If you catch him, then don't hesitate to hang him." Eleanore spoke with unwavering hatred. "And if he runs, don't miss when you squeeze the trigger. I can't provide you with more valuable information than that." Eleanore passed the envelope back to Hans. "You won't help me?" Hans shot his head back in surprise. "Why? Do you still love him?" "I didn't love him then, and I don't love him now." Eleanor's eyes bulged at the outrageous accusation. "Then why won't you help me?" "My life has been uprooted enough." Eleanor's lips trembled as she spoke. "I need to go home. I need to return to my flat, to my shop. I need to eat. I need to rest. I need my life back." "Berlin is in ashes." Hans spoke bluntly. "Whatever life you once had is now gone." It shouldn't have come as a surprise, but to hear Hans utter these words shattered whatever fabrication she clung to, that life could return to normal. The beautiful city where she had grown up, where her lovely little shop had been, where Ruth and Alex had given her many wonderful memories, was now destroyed. What was she, if not the seamstress of La Venezia? "There is nothing for you there." Hans continued to speak without much emotion, but waited patiently for Eleanore while she absorbed the devastating news. "If you don't believe me, then ask anyone, including some of your previous captors. They continued with these camps even when it was clear that they had lost the war. They persisted in murdering my people, and those like yourself who resisted, even when the orders had ceased." "How did you know that I'm from Berlin?" Eleanore watched him with increasing mistrust. "I know a few things about you, Miss Hodes." Hans lifted the envelope and waved it briefly before slapping it back down on the table. "But I also know that Berlin is not your native home. Your accent isn't natural to you. It's close, but there are a few words here and there that give you away." "Vienna," Eleanore explained, impressed with Hans's investigative abilities, giving her confidence that if anyone could catch Rudolf, it would be the man in front of her. "All right. What do you need from me?" "To start, a statement. Then, once the trials commence, it would be beneficial to have you take the stand as a witness." "Absolutely not." Eleanore shook her head. The thought of her being near to anyone involved with Auschwitz gave her immense anxiety. "We can discuss that later." Hans held up his hand to calm her. "Can we begin, at least, with your statement?" "You said Rudolf Huss escaped?" Eleanore took another puff from her cigarette. "That's right." Hans nodded. "He wanted me dead while I was at Auschwitz." Eleanore glanced down at her still swollen belly, indicating the reason. "If I give you this statement, it's likely that he will try to have me killed." "We'll protect you." Hans opened the tattered notepad and prepared to write. "He can't hurt you any more." At this, Eleanore burst into tears and turned away to hide her shame. Her hand trembled as the ash from her cigarette fell to the floor. Rudolf, she felt, was ever present. He was the shadow in the corner of the room, the unsettling feeling that someone was behind her. How could Hans be so arrogant to assume that he could protect her? The damage that Rudolf did was irreversible. "Eleanore," Hans continued with a little more sympathy, "this is the right thing to do." He relaxed his shoulders and showed, for the first time, a genuine emotion. "You can help bring justice to an untold number of lives who have been affected by this Nazi plague." "I'm so tired." Eleanore leaned back in her chair and took another puff of her cigarette. "We're all tired, Miss Hodes." Hans spoke casually, but, by the look he received from Eleanore, knew that he should have kept silent. "You've still got meat on your bones," Eleanore muttered bitterly under her breath and closed her eyes. "I didn't intend to insult you." Hans shook his head and paused before continuing, as Eleanor sensed a rage rising within him. "Truth is, I heard about the camps, but nothing could have prepared me for this. I want to find this bastard, and I want to find him now before he gets too far away." "I understand." Eleanor wiped the tears from her eyes. "I'll tell you my story, but on one condition." "What's that?" "Hide my identity, to some degree at least. I need your name." Hans looked at her with regret. "Just use my initials." Eleanor leaned forward. "Please." E.H. Hans spoke faintly as he wrote on the top of the page. "Thank you." Eleanor sighed and grabbed another cigarette. "Could I possibly have something to eat?" Sure." Hans thought for a moment, and then reached into his satchel and placed a red tin can on the table. Without reservation, Eleanor shoveled the spam-like product into her mouth. She must have looked mad to Hans, but she didn't care. She simply closed her eyes and chewed as quickly as possible to quiet her aching stomach. "Thank you." Eleanor nodded to Hans as she wiped her face with the sleeve of her borrowed dress. "Proceed when you're able." Hans held his pen at the ready. "Just tell me your story as best as you can remember it." "Well," Eleanor puffed her cigarette, "I owned a seamstress shop in Berlin, La Venezia, that was used as a secret meeting place for socialist Democrats, of which I was a patron. I also employed 2 Jews at the store, Ruth and Alex, who were the sweetest people I've ever had the privilege of knowing. Despite the race laws that came into effect, I refused to terminate their employment." "So you were arrested then?" Hans spoke as he wrote. "Not directly. I was warned by a Nazi official that I was on their list and that he would be returning within 24 hours to arrest me. We were childhood acquaintances, so he gave me the courtesy of a warning. As expected, we panicked and attempted to flee the country. Ruth, Alex, and I were duped into believing that we had an avenue to freedom with a certain gentleman who convinced me to forge Nazi Party papers." Eleanor shook her head as she remembered the crippled man who had deceived her. She wondered where he was now, and if he had been caught by the Allies, or if he even knew the conditions that he was cheating people into. If he had willingly sent people to the camps knowing how wicked they were, then Eleanor hoped that he was dead, as cruel as that sounded. "They arrested me under the charge of falsifying documents and took me to Auschwitz under this pretense and packed me into a stock car on a train brimming with prisoners." "Stock car?" Hans looked up from the paper. "It was hell." Eleanor began to shake as she recalled the horrific experience. There was no room to lie down or even to sit. They packed us in like cattle, and we had to stand amongst our own waste. The man beside me died standing upright. Eleanor paused as she waited for Hans to finish writing. The trembling in his hand made it difficult for him to maintain the same speed he was able to employ previously. She could perceive how difficult it was for him to accept her story, not from the sense of fabrication, but from disbelief that such a tragedy could occur. It was one thing to comprehend that death happened on a mass scale, but to uncover the details of how it was carried out and the conditions that he himself had barely escaped was disturbing. "What happened when you arrived at the camp? Were you aware of the gas chambers?" Hans dabbed the sweat from his forehead. "Not at first." Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut as she tried to remember. Such dreadful images were not something she was anxious to recall. "I saw the crematoriums, but I didn't understand their purpose until it was revealed to me some time later." "Did you ever witness anyone taken to the gas chambers?" "I saw those who were selected." Eleanor recalled the poor souls doomed to death in such a terrible manner, but initially I wasn't aware as to why they were selected. "And who was selected?" Hans sat back and took a quick breath as he tried to steady his anger. "The weak, the young, the elderly, anyone who was useless in their eyes." Hans paused after he had written down her last sentence, and Eleanor watched as he tried to comprehend what she was telling him. She assumed that if he was asking her about the gas chambers, then he was aware of their purpose, but to hear her describe who was taken was difficult for him to process. "What were the conditions like at Auschwitz?" Hans asked after he had gathered himself, but his eyes remained fixed on the paper. Eleanore understood that he needed to document her statement and these horrible facts with as little emotion as possible, as difficult as that was for him. Shocking. Eleanore stared at the ceiling as she recalled. Similar to what you've seen at this camp. They shaved our heads, humiliated us, and herded us into bunkers without insulation or heat. Many died of sickness or exhaustion or starvation. If you didn't work, then you died, but some of the inmates were worked to death. Death was everywhere. Death was more common than breathing. "What were your responsibilities in the camp?" Hans asked, as he looked at her with rising sympathy. Eleanore paused as she looked back at Hans. There was a denial lingering over him. She could see it in his eyes. The enormity, the unrepentant malice, and the brutality of these camps were not easily understood. Eleanore wondered if she herself fully understood what had happened. "I worked in the hospital under a cruel capo. My responsibility was to change the bedpans." "Why?" Hans scratched his head as he took a moment to think. "Why didn't anyone fight back?" "We tried." Eleanore shook her head slightly as she recalled the bravery of her sweet Ella. "But we had to be careful. I tried to help the resistance movement, but I was caught in a place where I shouldn't have been, and the capo who ran the hospital sent me to die in the standing cells." "A standing cell?" Hans looked at Eleanore as though he wished her not to answer. "It's a cell about the size of this chair." Eleanore shifted in her seat and began to shake. She closed her eyes and clenched her hands into fists as she recalled the clanking of metal against metal and the groans of starvation from the other inmates that were with her. She could still hear their screams for even just a drop of water. "How did you get out?" "Chance?" Eleanore shrugged as she opened her eyes and took a deep breath. Perhaps it was fate. Rudolph's wife, Hedvig, was searching for a seamstress to work at the villa. A certain lieutenant thought he could raise his standing with the commandant by providing what Hedvig was looking for. "That was kind of him." Hans narrowed his gaze, sensing there was more to the story. "The lieutenant." Eleanore cleared her throat as she recalled young. "He discovered my talents when I restored his uniform. I bartered my release from the standing cell in exchange for the repairs." "So you worked at the villa?" "For a brief spell." Eleanore scratched the back of her neck to ease some of the awkwardness. "Why brief?" "Rudolf Huss took notice of me and began to pursue what he hoped would be a mutual relationship. Hedvig put a quick end to this and terminated my employment." Eleanore cleared her throat. "So you engaged in relations with the commandant at the villa?" Hans frowned. "No." Eleanore shook her head and swallowed. But Rudolf wasn't deterred by my removal from the villa. He provided me with a private cell back in the camp where he could visit me at night. "I was under the impression that relations between an officer and an inmate were prohibited. How did he visit you?" "Not without risk." Eleanore tilted her head. "He was almost caught on one occasion. He would come late at night after sending the guards away." "Then your relationship was sexual?" "I'd like to discuss as little of this as possible." Eleanore glanced away, displeased with the casualness of his tone. "I don't mean to be indelicate." Hans put the pen down. "But you must understand that anything and everything we can use against this man will help bring him to justice. If his relationship with you was sexual, then we can build a case around that mistreatment." "There is no justice." Eleanore spoke bitterly as she stamped her cigarette out. "Not fully." Hans stared into the table. "Yet I'm certain that we can both agree that this man needs to be placed into custody. Yes, the relationship was sexual." Eleanore became agitated as she grabbed another cigarette, but not by choice. "He threatened to kill another inmate, one of the leaders of the resistance and a dear friend of mine, if I didn't sleep with him. Once it was discovered that I was pregnant, he must have panicked, as I never saw him again. He sent me to the standing cell and ordered that I be starved to death." "You were sent to the standing cells twice," Hans began, but was interrupted by an engine roaring to life outside the building. Eleanore clasped her hand to her chest in fright as the windows began to rattle. The Allied guards outside the room abandoned the documents and exited the building with weapons at the ready. Even Hans stood quickly and placed his hand to his pistol, further terrifying Eleanor's nerves that something sinister was transpiring. Hans tried to speak to Eleanor, but he was drowned out by the noise. Seeing that communication was useless, he gathered his belongings into his satchel and motioned for Eleanor to follow him. Trembling as she left the interview room, Eleanor walked closely behind Hans as they sped towards the exit. The earth beneath their feet began to rumble, and Eleanor imagined that the Nazis were launching a counter-assault. She was so close to being freed from this hell, but Eleanor feared that she had hoped too soon. They left the building quickly, but were met immediately by a wall of soldiers with their backs to them, watching something that was just beyond Eleanor's view. They held their weapons down by their sides, which was a relief to Eleanor that there was no threat, but the source of the noise was still curious. Passing through the group, Hans moved to get a glimpse of what was happening, and Eleanor followed closely behind him. Pushing their way to the front, Hans and Eleanor stopped abruptly when they realized the cause of the commotion. Holding her hand over her eyes to block out the sun, Eleanor witnessed a sight that, although she had lived in the camps, she still could not believe. A bulldozer had been brought into the camp, and it was digging into the earth, creating a large pit. Beside this pit were bodies that had been piled into a heap. Malnourished, pitiful corpses awaited their final resting place in this mass grave. Men and women were nearly indistinguishable from each other, with nothing but skin clinging to their skeletons. The sight was gut-wrenching, and Eleanor held a hand over her mouth as tears began to form. Even after all the time she had spent in Auschwitz, she could never be desensitized to such horrors. Soldiers wept as they carried out the terrible business of hauling the bodies to the pile. Prisoners watched vacantly, with some being days away from death themselves, and commanders shouted orders while concealing their emotions to complete the awful task at hand. Eleanor and Hans and the soldiers with them stood in silence as they watched. There were no words to dispel the terror, no comforts to be spoken which could eradicate the shock. The earth shook underneath their feet, the divine seemed absent, and the weight impressed on everyone's heart was irreversible. In the face of such overwhelming malevolence, Eleanor was unable to articulate what she was experiencing. Even her ability to think clearly had been stripped away, and all she was left with was the capacity to react. Glancing at Hans, Eleanor spotted tears in his eyes, but these were not the tears of sorrow. These were the tears of unbridled hatred and the unrestricted desire for revenge. She recalled the same yearning in Ella, and remembered how desperately she sought retribution for what the Nazis did to her husband. Eleanor had cautioned Ella against resentment, but now, when she looked at the faces of those gathered, she understood that their honorable vengeance would not be impeded. "I'll take you to the American camp." Hans spoke softly after the roar of the engine had been cut. "Now?" Eleanor looked at him curiously. "I don't want to be here any longer than necessary." Hans spoke with seething resentment as he remained fixated on the bodies. "We need to continue your statement so that I can catch the devil who is responsible for all this." Eleanor nodded as a desperation arose within her to escape. She wished that she carried the tenacity and courage to remain and help those who were less fortunate than herself. She had spent months in the camp witnessing the horrors of Auschwitz, but still some had lost more than their dignity. She remembered Em, who had lost her son, and Ella, who had lost her husband. Perspective, she understood, was fatal to self-pity. Her trials were greater than she could have imagined facing in her lifetime, but they failed in comparison to the loss of loved ones, especially the most precious amongst them. Signaling for her to follow him, Hans led Eleanor back to the camp gates. They walked past American soldiers who were shouting orders to one another, but Eleanor could only make out a word or two of English. Yet what she could comprehend disturbed her greatly. Disease, pestilence, quarantine. An emptiness grew in Eleanor's stomach with the sense that the release from her trials may not be as close at hand as she perceived. "Stay here." Hans paused just before they reached the gates. "I'll speak with the guards and explain the importance of having you released immediately." In agreement, Eleanore stood at a respectful
Sample complete. Ready to continue?